6, knight f3, d5 and knight c3. This is going to be a two-parter. In part 1 we will have a look at the moves 5 d4 and 5 bishop e2. In the starting position, black has three main options. He can go bishop g4, d takes e4 or knight f6. The problem with d takes e4 and bishop g4 is that it is very hard for black to play for a win. After d takes e4, knight takes, knight f6, knight takes f6, e takes f6, we see that black has a doubled pawn on the f-file. White has a healthy pawn structure. The position is around equal and black doesn't have too many problems, but it is rather white who can play for something here. It is very hard for black to play for a win. Bishop g4 has a similar problem. After h3, bishop takes, queen takes, we can see that white has still the pair of bishops, whereas black has only two knights and the bishop on f8. In the long run, this is also favorable for white. The position is also equal, like in the lamb before, but again it is rather white who can play for a win. This is why I recommend the move knight f6. Knight f6 is a move that leads to very enterprising positions where black can play for a full point. We will see complicated positions, we will even see a position with a king on e6 in the second part of the video. In the first part, we will have a look at bishop e2 and d4. Let's start with bishop e2. We take on c3, giving white doubled pawns. D takes bishop g4. It always makes sense to develop the bishop before we play e6, because otherwise we are left with a bad bishop on c8. And now knight g5. This is the point of the bishop e2 move on move 5. Knight g5 is an idea that has been essayed recently by no one less than Nigel Short. We take on e2, e6, bishop f4. White is strengthening the e5 pawn and preparing to castle either kingside or queenside. Knight d7, castle kingside, bishop e7 and now queen h5. White is very aggressive. The point is of course that black can't castle at the moment because of queen takes h7 checkmate. Bishop takes g5 is obviously not desired at all, because this would terribly weaken all dark squares. So black must play g6, queen h6 and bishop f8. It's not horrible to retreat the bishop because it will find a very nice square on g7. Queen h3. Here black has actually two moves, h6 or bishop to g7. Bishop g7 is the move I recommend, but there's nothing wrong with h6. Rook fe1 and queen e7. Unlike the previous move, h6 now would be a terrible mistake because it allows knight takes e6. After f takes e6, queen takes e6, queen e7, queen takes g6, white has already collected 3 pawns for the piece and is ready to push e6, which is very undesirable for black. Queen e7 is preparing the long castle. a4, long castle, queen e3, attacking a7, h6, knight f3, g5, bishop g3, king b8, a5. In the stem game, Nigel Short's opponent, Tingy Lai, went rook c8 here, which is a move I find a bit hard to understand. Instead, I recommend the move a7 to a6. a7 to a6 stops white from playing a6 himself. We have a position on the board where white tries to attack black on the queen side and black tries to attack on the king side. There are mutual chances and it is hard to say who's better. Objectively, I think the position is around equal, but I pretty much like black, and it is not so clear how white wants to make headway on the queen side. So far, so good. Let's have a look at the move fifth d4. And this move is more critical than it looks. We take on c3, b takes, e6, c4. And I recommend the move bishop b4 check. In several games black has tried to go c5 in this position, but I'm not at all convinced that this move is so good. C takes d5. Looks very harmless but is actually quite annoying. The problem is that queen takes d5 can hardly be recommended, because of c4. Now after queen d8, white would already be seriously better after d5. And white has a very stable center, black hasn't developed a single piece as yet. That means that after c4, black would be forced to go queen e4 check. Bishop e3, c takes d4, bishop d3 with a tempo, queen c6, knight takes d4, queen takes g2, and now white can even dare play king e2. We have a position on the board where black is a pawn up, but he hasn't developed a single piece yet. The only piece black did develop is the queen on g2, which is actually a target. White has developed 3 minor pieces in the center. He can attack the queen with rook g1, and he can also try queen a4 check ideas or queen b3. White has full compensation for the sacrificed material, and it is reasonably unpleasant to play for black. I cannot recommend this. Which means that after c5, c takes d5, black would have to take with a pawn. Bishop e2, knight c6 and castle. Now if black plays bishop e7, white could take on c5. And after bishop takes c5 we have an interesting position on the board. Personally, I really don't like black's structure. There is an isolated pawn on d5 and white can try to play on the b file with rook b1 and on the d file with, for example, queen d3 and rook d1. Black's position might not be entirely horrible. Perhaps the position is around equal, but I don't like the structure. So if we do not want to allow the isolated pawn, the only move we can play here is c4. White plays c3, bishop e7, knight e1, castle, and f4. And I have analyzed this position quite extensively, with and without an engine. According to the engine, the position is around equal, but I'm not so sure. The plans of both sides are pretty much obvious. White will try to transfer his knight to e3, play bishop f3, targeting the d5 pawn, and try to make f5, f6 work. Black will try to push a5, b5 and b4, creating counterplay on the queen side. I've come to the conclusion that white's plan is way more dangerous than black's, and if white manages to get f5 and f6 in, black's position will most likely just collapse. So all in all, this position is very, very dangerous for black, and I cannot recommend this. That means I had to find something else in this position. c5 does not convince me. Fortunately, I found a very nice idea. Bishop b4 check. Bishop d2, takes, and castle. On the first glance it seems strange to trade off the good dark squared bishop. But it makes a lot of sense. Black has already castled and it is ready to solve the tension in the center. White has two moves here, either bishop d3 or c takes d5. Bishop d3 is completely harmless because black can take on c4 and push c5, undermining the center and equalizing on the spot. So white needs to play c takes d, and bishop d3. And in this position I recommend the move h6. Why h6? White has all sorts of shenanigans connected with bishop takes h7, knight g5, h4, queen d3, trying to create some sort of an attack there. After h6, white cannot do that any longer. And white doesn't have anything better than castling. Black plays b6. The idea is obvious. Black wants to play bishop a6, trading off the bad bishop for the very good bishop on d3. If black succeeds in trading these bishops, black can play on the c-file and targeting the weak c2 pawn. Black would be completely fine, so white needs to do something. Rook fc1. This is a smart move, based on a little trick. Black goes bishop a6. The idea of rook fc1 was to remove the rook from the diagonal f1 a6. White has set a little trap, but we will fall into it because it is not bad for black. c4. White's point is that after bishop takes c4, bishop takes, d takes, rook takes c4, white would already be seriously better. The knight cannot go to c6, on a6 it would be terribly misplaced, and after knight d7 white could double on the c-file, which is already a very stable advantage. The alternative is d takes c4. And here we see the point of rook fc1. Had white played rook ac1, then after bishop a6, c4, takes, bishop e4, black would have ideas connected with c3, when the rook on f1 is hanging. After rook fc1, bishop a6, c4, dc4, bishop e4, it seems like white is winning an exchange. And in fact he is winning an exchange, but it is nothing big. After knight d7, bishop takes a8, queen takes a8, black has fantastic compensation. Now, what should white do? It makes sense to play for mate, and for that reason it's sensible to play rook c3, transferring the rook to the king side. Queen d5, or first rook d8, actually it doesn't matter. Queen f4, and now queen d5. White plays, say, h3. It should be noted that in this position white can already go wrong by playing a4. a4 was a serious mistake because it runs into knight c5. This knight is taboo in view of queen d1 check. And in the next move black will play knight b3, hitting the rook on a1 and the pawn on d4. Black is already better. For this reason white plays h3, making some luft for the king. Now after knight c5, queen d1, we could just take and play king h2. White would be winning. Black plays knight b8. And it's about time we took stock. Black has very active pieces and a complete light squared control. White has no light squared bishop anymore. The queen on d5 is very strong. Black also has a passer on c4, which is potentially very dangerous for white. Black will follow up with knight c6, targeting the weak d4 pawn. What should white do? It's not clear what white should aim for in this position. White cannot really play for mate because he cannot move the knight. Once the knight moves, d4 would be hanging. So all in all, black has one pawn for the exchange in this position and very active pieces. I'm sure that black has more than sufficient compensation, and in a practical game it is much easier to play for black. I think that bishop b4 is a very nice move that gives black at least full equality. In the next video we will have a look at the main line, 5 knight to e2.